How's everyone doing this evening? Thanks for joining us live with another AASPT podcast. Again, I'm your host, Scott Greenberg, and today we are super excited for our guest, Eric Helms, who will be talking all things hypertrophy. So, hope you're ready. Here we go. So again, I'm Scott. We got Eric and Megan and Owen here who are going to run this kind of discussion and lead the discussion with Eric and pose all difficult types of questions at him. And what I want you guys to do in the live is to really just kind of ask some questions, post some comments in the live comment section there on YouTube, and we'll get to those questions here as we discuss things with Eric. So again, don't be shy. Put your questions in there. And without further ado, I'm going to send it over to Megan so she can tell you all about Eric and introduce this wonderful guest we have today.
Yeah, so I'm Megan. I don't know if we said this is Sports Performance SIG, so I'm the chair of the Sports Performance SIG. We've got Eric Helms joining us today. If you don't know who he is, Eric has his PhD in strength and conditioning. He is the chief science officer of 3DMJ, which is a bodybuilding and training company. He hosts the podcast Iron Culture, which if you haven't listened, definitely check it out. He's also the founder of the research review MASS, which is monthly applications in strength sport. So another amazing resource for kind of monthly strength and conditioning research. And he also competes as a WNBF pro bodybuilder. And as he proclaims, mediocre in other sport athletes as well. So powerlifting. But yeah, Eric, why don't you tell them a little bit more about yourself and maybe some of the research that you've gotten into lately?
For sure. No, I really appreciate that introduction. Yeah, I'm essentially just someone who got bit by the iron bug and then found out that I was just as intellectually interested in it as I was physically. And it became my vocation, my passion, my interest. And actually looking back and understanding my own personality, that I only do the thing I want to do all in. It's very unsurprising. And that one other thing led me to eventually all the things you mentioned, but also coming out to New Zealand to do my PhD at Auckland University of Technology, and eventually coming on board as a research fellow here and now a senior research fellow. So what I do, referencing the research you mentioned, is I describe myself as a sports scientist, and my specific sports that I do sports science in are strength and physique sport. So that's kind of cool because it overlaps into S&C, it overlaps into sports physiology and nutrition. It allows me to be a generalist in a very narrow area. So like if you figure that one out. Yeah, so a lot of the research I do is related to the performance, body composition, psychology, coaching, sustainability, and optimization of outcomes for both strength and physique sport. So yeah, that's essentially what I do. And that can span anything from measuring changes in body composition following a period of trying to put on muscle mass and minimize fat gain, to doing interviews with people who have done nutrition coaching for years in a mixed methods style, trying to determine what has seemed to help their athletes be successful or their clients successful long-term weight loss, to reviews on body image. So it's kind of a cool launching point to look at various interdisciplinary approaches to helping physique and strength sport athletes, whether they're recreational or competitive, get what they want out of the sport and not have it kind of chew them up and spit them out, which does often happen.
Yeah, that's super cool. Do you feel like there is a lack of research in physique athletes out there?
The interesting thing is there's actually been a fair amount of research in this area in the last decade, starting with case studies and then people writing like narrative reviews. I think bodybuilders have always been very interested in physiology and obsessive. So it's sort of a personality thing. And they've kind of led the charge in many of the more exploratory, experimental sides of sport. Basically, they're the ones who have explored performance-enhancing drug use to probably a greater degree than any other type of athlete. Like if you look at a lot of the techniques and approaches used by athletes who decide to go that route, you can trace it back to some someone who identify as a bodybuilder or a bodybuilding coach who was, doing things that wouldn't pass an ethics board. So I would argue that there's a surprising amount of research on bodybuilding, but the quality, applicability of it, and utility of it is challenged because of a lack of funding and resources. It's not like, NIH is like, Eric, please tell me how to get bigger biceps, and here's $2 million to do it. So I would say there's a fair amount of research interest, and a lot of people in the resistance training space, have been exposed to that through their own personal interest. There's very few sports scientists who don't participate in sport or fitness, so that's probably unsurprising. But I think sports science, the field, is early and in its infancy. So I think the quality could be substantially improved, and we're still getting to the point where, like, methodologically, we're catching up with some of the more established medical fields.
Yeah, so you do a lot of work on hypertrophy, and obviously that translates over to bodybuilding and physique athletes, because your main priority is you want to build muscle, show off certain muscle during the show. But obviously, as physical therapists and rehab practitioners, our goals for wanting to build muscle mass, build strength, like that sort of research also interests us, because if we know how to maximize muscle, we know how to maximize strength, we can help people get better faster, especially after surgery, after injury. So when we think about hypertrophy, that's not something that we are typically tracking over time with our patients. We're looking at maybe more objective measures of strength or things that are easier to measure clinically. So, like, with your hypertrophy type research, sort of how much do you feel like hypertrophy and strength interplay with one another? Like, would you maybe say you're trying to get somebody back after a knee injury and you're trying to build strength, but they've lost some muscle mass? Like, how important do you think it is to try to rebuild that muscle to the same size? And, like, how much overlap in the training do you feel like there is between hypertrophy and strength? And that's a very large question, I know.
It is. I'm going to give you permission to like, you have a corral, which, as a city boy, I don't even know what that means, but you can corral me at any point. Something, horses, lasso. You can have a big, this is old school, but like a big hook that if my acceptance speech is going too long, you just yank me back where you need me.
Scott too, feel free to interrupt with questions, because this is something I feel like with the rehab standpoint, we focus a lot on strength, but there's not a lot of intentional hypertrophy training that is being done, and I think sometimes that's a missing component to rehab. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
So conceptually, I think the best way to view this is that strength is the expression of force in a given task, right? And that's easy. And then those tasks can differ substantially from an isometric task to a dynamic task to a simple to a more complex dynamic task, spanning more than one joint, or a closed or open environment. Almost everything is essentially a strength task when you think about it. Cutting on the field, even if it's just your body weight, standing up off the toilet, etc. Everything, activities of daily living, sport, or an isolated test that we might do, a hand grip dynamometer. So the underpinning physiological factors that result in the ability to express that strength support our motor learning skill to express that task. And that interaction is relatively complex. And when we look at it in the research, it is complex and confused enough that there are some sports scientists who debate that hypertrophy even contributes to strength. I don't fall on that side of the debate. I think it's very difficult to answer that question in an empirical manner. Like, if you think about it, if I wanted to set up an RCT to determine if changes in hypertrophy contributed to changes in, say, 1RM strength, what I'm actually needing to do is make hypertrophy the independent variable. So I would have to randomly assign hypertrophy. You can't do that. We don't have a magic get jacked wand, or bodybuilding would be much less fun, in my opinion. What we have are different protocols. So when we start comparing protocols, now we're actually a step removed from what we really would want to do from an epistemology perspective. That is, we have to have one person training for hypertrophy in some way, another person training for strength and trying to minimize hypertrophy, and then seeing how they interact, and then you cross them over, or you do a within subject design. It gets quite messy. So it is very difficult to defensively say, causationally, I can show you exactly how hypertrophy results in strength gain. But through various designs and perspectives, I think the current consensus in sports science is that when certain conditions are satisfied, hypertrophy plays a contributory role to enhancing strength or allowing for strength to be higher. That's probably the best way to put it. So one thing that you can say is that probably even more relevant to a physical therapy population or a rehab population is that if I was to grab anybody off the street right now and I was to give them a isokinetic, or even better, let's say an isometric test. So just single joint angle, single joint, push on this thing as hard as you can, and we're going to measure force. We're going to see actually a really strong relationship that delineates between individuals where the more muscle mass they have, the higher that number will be. And it'll be a pretty strong correlation. It gets messy when the change score starts happening. But most people are not actually training, right? Most people, especially in your guys' experience, they're not going to be interfacing with resistance training until there's a problem that now they're trying to correct and get back to baseline. So the question of whether or not a power lifter should be spending a whole bunch of time doing hypertrophy training is a different fundamental question to, I've got someone who has regressed from the level of muscularity they had due to an injury, the time off, being bedridden, or not being able to move and having joint immobilization, whatever. Do I want to, put some emphasis on regaining that muscle? And I would say probably yes, because a large portion of their strength loss, and something that absolutely predicts life quality and life quantity, is sarcopenia, which is the age-related loss of muscle mass. And when you look at someone who's experienced in sarcopenia and they're in their third or fourth decade of life, and they also experience an injury, the risk factors for a early death or a substantial drop in quality of life start to skyrocket. It can quite literally be a death sentence to fall when you're 70 something, believe it or not. So considering that not only does muscle mass correlate with lower risk and consequences to falls, but also other aspects of strength, which is quite important, and like, balance and things like that. But simple answer, they are related. They shouldn't be the only focus. Obviously, if there's a specific task, this is the, sports physical therapy kind of focus. But there are many times when you can't actually, in practice, focus on the task that the athlete would like to be doing because of the injury, but you can do some things to work around it to try to minimize atrophy or even generate some hypertrophy. And I do think that will have a considerable impact on reducing time to return to play.
I think you just hit on something that I was thinking of. Is the question I have is, like, in the rehab world, oftentimes, when you're talking about damaged tissue, irritated tissue, oftentimes the traditional or typical range of reps for strength training is 3 to 5, 3 to 6, somewhere in that range, and hypertrophy is that 8 to 12. So the likelihood of overstressing an injured or irritated tissue is quite less if you're going to a higher rep range, doing less weight than doing traditional strength training. So I think that's where it kind of gets a little bit muddy, is that we in therapy, I think, traditionally do a lot more hypertrophy repetition range work than true strength training early on. And as time goes on, you can periodize the plan a little bit. You can start to incorporate a lot more strength into it. But early on, I think most people that aren't necessarily at the level of working with performance athletes and stuff typically live in that, 8 to 10 to 12 to 13, 14, 15 range, which is mainly in that hypertrophy range.
Yeah. I would say the caveat is that it's typically very low load. And I'm not sure what you can talk about here, kind of factors that play into what actually causes hypertrophy. Like if you're doing a body weight set of 8 to 10 squats, maybe if you're severely deconditioned, that is eliciting some adaptation. But, if we're talking about what sort of intensity is needed for that 8 to 10 or, whatever sort of rep range you're working in, if it's to failure, doesn't matter. But like, what do you think are the most important things to actually elicit hypertrophy in an athlete?
In an athlete is a really important caveat.
Or in anyone, I guess. But this is the sports performance section, so a lot of our stuff is, I would say, ranging from like high school. A lot of us work with high school, college athletes, where sure they do training, but there is still a lot of room for growth in terms of, I guess, strength maturity, muscle building that happens during, let's say, I see a lot of people after ACL injury, so we'll see people from age 15 to 16. And so, there's a lot of room to like build muscle in these individuals.
Yep.
Even though they are, I say, technically athletes. So
for sure. And there's a big difference in different codes of athletes. Some of them are very well developed in certain muscle groups. Think track cyclists, and their quadriceps, but they don't necessarily have like amazing arms or anything like that. So anyway, to answer your question, the key variables in terms of what do we actually put down in our Excel spreadsheet or on paper in training that seem to result in hypertrophy are pretty well elucidated at this point. There was actually a recently published meta-regression by Robinson and colleagues. See, I told you I can't help it. Where they quantified across hundreds of participants in their meta-regression RIR. And they're estimating this from velocity-based research, actual data where people report RIR, and then our known estimated relationship between percentage 1RM and reps performed, as well as some data on like cluster sets. And what they were able to report is that there is generally a linear relationship between proximity to failure and hypertrophy when all else is held equal, which is a huge caveat. But essentially what it's saying is that when we look just at an individual set, all else equal, the closer to failure, the greater the stimulus for hypertrophy. The interesting thing, though, is that relationship held true all the way from like a 10 RIR. So being 10 reps shy of failure, on average, when all else is equal, in the population group studied, still produces some hypertrophy stimulus on average. Again, majority of studies are not on super well-trained individuals. And that is important because many athletes for the given muscle groups we're talking about are going to be basically closer to untrained than trained if we're to broadly dichotomize that. So that's different than like if you were to take me and all of a sudden I was like, you know what, I'm just going to do 10 RIR and everything. And then we interfaced again in 6 months, you'd be like, so you still training, Eric? I would regress a little bit because I've been lifting for 20 years obsessively to become a competitive bodybuilder. That's not the same thing as I've been quote unquote training 2 years with some off-season strength conditioning for soccer, right? So knowing that there's a linear relationship doesn't necessarily tell you what to do on Tuesday with the athlete, but it does help us understand the underpinnings of the variables associated with hypertrophy. So proximity to failure is important. Getting sufficient distance from the most you can do in a given set. And this is modified by other factors. We talked about operating in different rep ranges. Interesting moderator in this meta-regression was that when they looked at studies that you'd say 40% of 1RM, 60% of 1RM, or 80% of 1RM, the slope or the strength of that relationship between being closer to failure and getting greater hypertrophy started to flatten out. And this actually makes intuitive sense because when you're using 80% of 1RM, you're already closer to failure. You're only going to be able to do like 6 to 10 reps, right? So you're starting close to failure. And then mechanistically, we know when you look at, say, 80% of MVIC or maximum voluntary contraction strength, which is pretty equivalent to the percentage of 1RM, more or less, once you get above that 80% range, you're actually recruiting almost all the muscle fibers involved in the movement. And then it's a matter of how much exposure do they get once being recruited to getting a training stimulus. So this is where some of the other research we have on why do we even think of there being a quote unquote hypertrophy rep range. And that's that you need to have a sufficient amount of volume of contractions at a sufficient proximity to failure to produce that hypertrophy. So not only do we see a relationship exemplified by Robinson where closer you get to failure, you seem to, have a more stimulus per hypertrophy. We also see a relationship with volume. The more work you do, the more total contractions of a sufficient intensity. We generally see a increasing response with hypertrophy, with the caveat that if we want to count this as total volume being like, say, hard sets, those sets need to last long enough. And we have a fair bit of research that indicates somewhere around, like, say, the 4 to 6 rep range is probably kind of the lower end threshold, so long as the load is sufficiently high. So this gives us some opportunities to play with different proximity to failure and rep range combinations for sets.
Mhm.
So let's say we take a set of 80% and we know that, okay, now proximity to failure is not that important anymore. The load's sufficiently high. And we want to give someone some exposure to a reasonably heavy load, but we don't want to push them all the way to failure. Maybe they're more new, maybe they're getting back into it. You could do 4 reps with 80% of 1 RM and stop 3 to 4 reps shy of failure. That would feel subjectively easy, but still subjectively heavy. It would probably have a little more transfer to task, and that might be more acceptable or a nice way to lead someone into something, especially if they're deconditioned. Likewise, if you have someone who is used to lifting heavy and they've lost some muscle mass, you could give them a higher rep set. Maybe the load tolerance is the issue where they start to experience pain. And you know that, okay, well, I'm going lighter. I will need to push it closer to failure. And that's something I can do. And that will also stimulate hypertrophy. And whether I do a set of 12 to a 0 to 2 RIR or a set of 4 to 6 to a 2 to 4 RIR, those two sets are going to probably, from a hypertrophy perspective, be roughly equivalent and sufficient to be generally similar in terms of the stimulus. And that's the type of thing you can start to play with, and that interacts with exercise selection, to kind of give you a lot more options to play with. And there's more to it than that, of course, but that's kind of the bigger picture, like volume intensity principles of hypertrophy. It's proximity to failure, lasting sufficiently long for an individual set to be counted on equal footing, and then understanding that there is a relationship between total sets as well with hypertrophy.
I think Eric just jumped on a fact or a whole concept that we deal with blood flow restriction training, right? So you're getting somebody closer to failure quicker with blood flow restriction versus having them do, 50, 60, 70 reps at a lower weight type of experience. So yeah, that was the first thing that popped into my head when you were talking about that. Is that's exactly what blood flow restriction does.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was gonna. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Owen.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna ask, when we're defining proximity to failure, how are we looking at failure? Is it full range of motion inability? Is it like, because I know more research, partial length and partials are very hot right now. So if an individual cannot achieve a full range of motion, but they're still achieving a partial range of motion, does continuing with that, how does that factor in or play into the equation?
Great question, because if we're going to try to take practice from translational research, we need to understand what they did, so we're translating something that is representative. So in most of the research on proximity to failure, reaching a certain proximity to failure, or reaching failure, probably is an easier way of defining it, is typically defined in either a very objective manner as a momentary muscular failure, which is when they've actually attempted a concentric repetition to the standard of whatever the researcher set out, and they were unable to complete it. So that could mean, like, let's say if they're doing a lat pull down and they need to get it to the chin height, if they get it to their nose, that counts as failing on that rep. Would we actually do that in practice? Maybe, but that's what you're looking at when you're reading a study where they're talking about momentary muscular failure. And when that occurs in a movement where biomechanically it's going to occur much earlier and be much more clear failure than something where the strength curve, like a row or a pull down, is occurring as the muscle is getting shortened towards the end range of the motion, like a leg press, it just stops, right? You're trying to get it up and, well, I need some help because now I'm pinned under a leg press, right? Same thing with like a bench, you better have a spotter, right? You don't need a spotter on a lat pull down. So that kind of dichotomy is useful to understand where the ambiguity comes into it. Or like a dumbbell lateral raise, like I could probably keep going if I just didn't go as high, and maybe I use a little body English. So that's why when you read a good resistance training study, they very clearly and objectively define what is considered in a rep that is counted. And then they very clear, less often, ideally, they clearly define what is failure. Sometimes they'll say something like a repetition maximum, period, or volitional failure, which that is clear. It means when the person believes they have reached failure, they stop. But it also means that two different people's perception of what failure is could lead to a divergence of outcomes. because someone's ability to think, oh no, I definitely could have done another rep, or oh, I'm failing here, is different from being motivated by 5 graduate students and yelled at to go until you literally fail, and also having the confidence of having those spotters around you.
Yeah.
So it is an aggregate of all of those together, which I think is useful to know.
Sure.
Another useful piece of information, however, Owen, is that when we experimentally test someone's ability to gauge proximity to failure, it's better than you might anticipate, at least in controlled lab conditions. So one of the typical ways we do this is we will have someone, say, on bench, they're doing reps, and then at lockout, they'll call out, I think I can do 3 more reps, or that's a 3, or they'll say something that doesn't require them to completely lose their breath and die. Like now, maybe. And you go, okay, I want you to call out now when you think you're at a 3 RIR. And then you keep going until you can no longer get any more reps. And then we just simply look at the difference between predicted and actual repetitions to failure. And when we look at that, on average, people are only off by about 1 rep, with the moderating factor that when you're doing high rep sets over 12, based upon a meta-analysis by Halperin, again, can't help it, at that point, you start to see greater uncertainty. So as anyone knows who's done old school bodybuilding, like squat stuff, like Widowmakers or breathing squats, when you're doing very, very high rep work, the overall global fatigue you experience and the discomfort and pain can certainly make you think you're closer to failure than you actually are. There's also some single joint movements, like seated leg extensions. For most people, they create a pretty intense burning, and you're like, oh, that's 15. I couldn't have possibly done any more. But if like Tom Platz was there and he had a gun to your head, you'd probably get 3 or 4 more reps, you know?
So just imagine that.
Exactly. Tom Platz with a gun is how you get through your workouts. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of going to be my question with RAR, RPE. Like for a lot of our like post-op patients or people who are in pain, it's maybe not feasible for us to do actual 1 rep max testing for safety reasons, pain, whatever. For people who maybe don't have as much exposure to strength training, how do you best sort of teach somebody how to estimate RAR or RPE? Or is that your preferred method for somebody who maybe doesn't have as much exposure to lifting, or how might you address that?
You know, the interesting thing in novices and people who are coming back from injury and they're detrained and they're retraining is, to some degree, it doesn't matter that much, because we want to be expanding their envelope of function. We want to be giving them this gradual exposure to a stimulus, and they don't need to be pushing to their maximum capacities, because their maximum capacity is diminished and they're below it. And, you know, to give a more extreme example, someone who is not training at all, but now they've been immobilized or on bed rest, simply getting them walking again, and they will actually hypertrophy, right? There's evidence on this, like walking programs in sedentary individuals produce some increases in lean body mass. So, but we can't just look at that in a kind of univariate manner and be like, oh, walking causes hypertrophy. Again, we take it even further. You give me not even the 10 RIR program, but hey, Eric, I want you to do the walking bodybuilding program. I come back 3 months from now, and you will definitely notice that something bad happened. So it wouldn't just be a little bit of shrinking because I'm doing junk volume. It'd be like, yo, you stopped lifting. So I think it needs to be put into context. So to answer your question much more directly, I don't necessarily see this as a problem that someone is probably training further from failure than they think they are in those types of situations, because part of the skill of becoming a lifter, even in a non-injured population, is getting better and better at gauging what are my capacities and how can I push closer to it. I think that's just part of the process of going from novice to intermediate, and novices simply don't need even to be pushing that hard from a progressive overload standpoint. You know, if you've the heaviest squat you've done is the weight of your body when you set up off the couch, then do you really need over 80% of 1RM to stimulate strength gains? No, like any weight more than that is quite progressive from where you're at. And in an injured population, you know, even more so, you're probably trying to hold them back a little bit and then gauge what they can do. But I do think it's a very useful opportunity to make them aware of their capacities. And I think it can be quite an empowering process of building self-efficacy. Some of the things I like to do are on movements that are not related to the injury, or are not necessarily as complex or risky, getting them to push closer to failure, just so that they can see the disparity between where they think they are and where they could be, because I think that's a little more of a holistic experience. Another useful thing that you can have them focus on is less on their body feelings, but also on the speed of the implement. So if they are moving a cable, dumbbell, barbell, and it doesn't slow down at all, you can help them think about that. Like, oh, it might feel hard, but let's just think about proximity to failure more objectively. Like, it's going to slow down, so you can teach people to focus a little more as they're learning kind of the internal sensations and the relationship between proximity to failure, to see the speed of the implement. And then they can even videotape their own sets and go, yeah, it felt hard, but those reps were all fast or all the same speed. That can be quite helpful. So feedback from the coach, controlled conditions where they actually train to failure and see the disparity between they thought, and then reviewing video with an attentiveness to bar speed or the equivalent, I think are all really useful strategies to help people understand that. And the beauty of it is that most of the time, people are under-predicting in the scenarios we're talking about. They think they're closer to failure than they are. It's only some athletes in team sport environments who are on the other side of the coin, like they grind out a nasty rep and they post it on Instagram. And they're like RPE 6, but that self-corrects, because if it was an RPE 6 and you're like, yeah, I just squatted 315, sweet, let me chuck 365 on there, they get pinned and they go, oh, that wasn't an RPE 6, so.
They didn't rest long enough.
Correct. They just needed to rest for 3 months of training, and they would have been fine.
Yeah. Eat some more carbs, get their muscle glycogen back, and they'll be good to go.
Yeah.
So you just hit on something also that I think when you said carbs, it made me think of like diet, right? So when you're thinking about bodybuilding and the world that you lived in, and Megan and myself kind of did a little bit of dabbling in, diet is pretty much, at least I felt it was like 90% of what we needed to do to get to where, you can lift and lift and lift, but if your diet's not, you can't, what do they say? You can't out train a bad diet, right? So the thing that we see in the rehab world is, we have these deficiencies in muscle mass and muscle strength. And at least I tend to find my athletes during the time when they're not necessarily competing and at their normal exercise level, they tend to not eat as well, which is exactly counterproductive as to what you'd want. So in your opinion, how important is the actual protein intake and diet to the hypertrophy equation?
The funny thing is, while it's true that you can't out train a bad diet, you also can't out diet bad training. Sure. Like if you think about it, if you give someone the perfect nutrition plan and they don't lift, it's not going to go well. If I put you on the perfect weight gain plan with the appropriately sized surplus, nutrient timing is obsessively and past what we can even speculate on how important it is in the research, dialed in. Protein intake is, a solid standard deviation above what we think will maximize things. They're going to gain like 3 kilos of fat and nothing else, right? So I think we need to understand that the training is actually planting the seed. Now, if you don't provide sunlight, if you don't provide good soil, if you don't water the seed, it's not going to grow. But the seed is critically important. And I think that's in the bodybuilding world. Eventually, we have kind of like this expertise bias. Like, there's very few bodybuilders who are just phoning it in when they go to the gym. They don't lack for effort. They don't lack for volume. They're typically either doing a ton of work at a reasonably high intensity, or a low amount of work at a very high intensity, or some combination thereof. But you don't see someone who's just kind of coming in and just, doing the pink weights, right? Ironically, occasionally you will see that in the very drugged up world, because you kind of, at certain levels of anabolics, you can just kind of wiggle the muscle.
They don't want their tendons to blow,
Yeah, and some of that's also genetics, but nonetheless.
That's a sign. That's a telltale sign that somebody's enhanced, right? Pink weights, big muscles, enhanced, right?
Well, also, I might have amazing parents, and I'm probably looked better than most natural pros when I was in high school. There's combined factors here.
There you go.
But you take a thoroughbred athlete who is also on a lot of drugs, and did you go to the gym? We're good, But if you look at, say, like high-level drug-free bodybuilders, you almost never find someone whose training is like completely terrible. Right. So I think some of that bias creeps in, because then what determines who's going to do really well in that contest prep season is who dieted well, lost fat mass, and didn't lose muscle mass. And then they start to emphasize the thing that is the barrier to them being better, which in many cases is nutrition. Now, that is a whole separate conversation. What you're talking about, absolutely, this is a motivational factor, is that a lot of people struggle with the concept of not being an all or nothing thinker. So when training is terrible, when they can't, even live to their own self-identity as an athlete, they tend to fall off with all of their patterns. I can't go train. I'm not in the team sessions. I'm not playing. Like, why wouldn't I get a pizza? But it is actually compounding things. So in my experience, most athletes do really well with goal-directed behavior and being given clear guidelines and opportunities to win, and then just getting them to think about the present here and now, not about what they can't do, but what they can. And then how do we give you a lot of opportunities to win whatever mini game or mini competition you're in, which is rehab and nailing your diet. And if you can get them to reframe things in that manner, they often come back stronger, because now they can focus even more on some of the things that maybe they weren't as focused on when they were healthy. You take an athlete with strong athletic identity, they just want to play their sport. They're doing the S&C to help the sport, but whatever. And now you give them, because they really don't have any other option, all I can focus on is rehab, S&C, nutrition, and lifestyle. Then if they can develop and retain those behaviors, now you layer on top of the fact that they really like playing their sport, practicing, and getting better at it, and they can actually see some type of leap forward after the fact. So that's kind of some of the coaching and psychological framing that I think is quite important when you're dealing with someone in an injury state. Is, okay, we got new constraints. How do we optimize within them? And that can sometimes kind of hook into that athlete mentality and make things even better. I do this to myself all the time. Like when I travel, I get excited about, how do I make this hotel gym give me a good leg workout? I don't focus on the fact that I'm not going to get as good of a normal leg workout. There's no pendulum squat here, and they have 50-pound dumbbells at the heaviest. I'm like, all right, so if I did single leg Bulgarians, I start getting excited about that. It becomes a mini game. So I think the big question is, how do you get the athlete to focus on what they can do, what they have agency over, rather than what they don't, that can potentially fall outside of our scope and maybe bigger issues and yada, yada, yada. But to answer your question more directly, protein matters. Not nearly as much as you might expect. So when we look at the most recent meta-analyses we have, there was one published by Nunez, I think in 2022. So you can't help it. And they found that the highest effect size occurred when you're at 1.6 grams per kilograms or higher of protein, which is about 0.7 gram per pound. And that was found actually in an earlier meta-analysis by Morton in 2018. I swear to God, I can't help it. And that trend is continuing. We're getting more and more, confidence, and that roughly being where things start to be maximized to the point where we can't tell a difference. But that's not to say that anything less than that is a negative or bad. In fact, in the 1.2 to 1.59 bracket, there was still a positive effect size on muscle gain, which for many of us with a bodybuilding background or currently who are bodybuilders, you're like, wait, 1.2 grams per kilogram? That's like half a gram per pound-ish? Like, no way. My biceps would fall off. But the reality of it is that when we look at research on protein, in about 3/4 of the studies, we see non-significant differences between groups. And then about the other 24.9% of them, we see a positive small effect favoring the higher protein group. And then in the aberrant, sampling variance 0.1% of the time, it goes the other way, which is not real. It's just the way human research works. But when you put all that data together, and now you have the equivalent of 800 participants, and you look at the pooled effect size with the uncertainty, you go, oh, there's a very clear, small beneficial effect of a high protein intake, but it is just that. So kind of in the order of importance, there is sufficient energy intake, not being in a status of low energy availability, not being in a large deficit. And then after that, protein intake matters, and other variables depending upon the energetic demands of their sport and life. But ultimately, nutrition, I think, should be seen as permissive to muscle gain and supportive of it. but you can't force feed gains any faster than they otherwise would occur. There's a great study that I love that was done in the early 2000s by Rosnick and colleagues. They took young university-aged men and they put them on a hypertrophy program. One group, they just had them follow their habitual diet. One group, they gave a weight gainer shake that was purely maltodextrin. So basically just here's 2,000 calories of sugar you're going to have every day on top of your normal diet. And then another one, they gave a 20%, 80% breakdown of protein and carbohydrate. And the two groups, both of them, regardless of whether they had 2,000 calories of sugar water on top of their diet or the whey protein mixture, which you'd think would be better, gained 3 kilos, roughly 7 pounds of weight and lean mass with no change in fat mass over 8 weeks. And the group that did not get the weight gainer shake, who just followed their habitual diet, they gained about 1.5 kilos of lean mass and gained about 0.75 kilos of total mass, and they lost close to 1 kilo of fat mass. That's how powerful the stimulus of resistance training is in someone who's not training, is that your body finds a way. Like, oh, you're not going to feed me enough to maximally grow. All right, well, I'm going to lose 1 kilo of fat mass, be actually in a calorie deficit when you think about the energy density of fat mass versus lean mass, but still gain, 2 to 3 pounds of muscle from underfeeding while I'm training. So that just shows you how powerful that stimulus is. And that then if you support it, if you give someone a whole bunch of extra calories on top of their normal diet, then they can grow even more if they have the capacity to do so. If you give a 2,000 calorie weight gain to experienced athletes or people with 3 years of hardcore resistance training experience versus only a small surplus, you don't see much of a difference except for additional fat gain, which is something that our lab found out, as well as a study in Norway that came out in the 2010s. So it is really very much conditional. How much muscle mass can you put on? At what rate are you trying to grow? And then what is your training status? And then is the training itself stimulative? Because if it is not, there's no amount of overfeeding that will allow you to gain faster muscle.
So whenever you're doing bodybuilding and we're talking about just like preservation of muscle, like whenever you're in a cut or you're in a deficit, do you change your training to try to like reduce stress on the muscle, or how do you go about trying to preserve muscle mass in the face of, like a large cut or a caloric deficit or increased cardio training?
Great question, Megan. And this I'm going to do one of those things where there's an obvious answer I could just give you, but I'm going to give you a conceptual thing, and then 30 minutes later I'll give you the answer.
That's perfect. That's exactly what we wanted.
No one actually wants that, but it's the only way I operate. So it is what it is. You're going to learn, damn it, whether you want to or not.
We're going to like it.
Yeah, you're going to like it. So I think conceptually, it's important to understand that being in a deficit or a surplus is not an on and off switch. And there are times throughout the day where you are in the postprandial state, you're in a surplus when you're cutting. Like if you just had a large meal, but by the end of the day, you're in a net deficit, you will be in a postprandial state with plenty of energy availability for that 1 to 2 hour period after you ate. And by the end of the day, you will have lost some small amount of fat mass, most likely, right? And the opposite is true as well. Some point 6 hours into you sleeping, when you're in a quote unquote bulking phase, you are in a net energy deficit. You're pulling on liver glycogen, you're pulling on adipose tissue to just meet the energy needs of the body. And that is happening all the time. And it's kind of like a bank account. You can, if you have $1,000 in your bank account right now, you can spend it. But if tomorrow your rent's due, a check's going to bounce. I just showed my age there. Your account's going to go negative. I swear to God, I'm not 41. I am. I remember checks. So that's kind of the nature of things. So what does that mean? It means that the way we preserve muscle is actually fundamentally the same way that we grow muscle. Because any time where there is not a stimulus to produce muscle growth, we're leading towards entropy. Not to sound like a nihilist, but you will eventually start to regress to the mean, or the untrained mean of what you were, right? If you don't have a minimum effective dose of training for a given training status, novice, intermediate, or advanced, you will regress to the next level. So you can give an untrained person just one set to failure per week for a given muscle group, and for 1 to 2 years, they will make great progress, and then they'll plateau. We actually have a data set on 15,000 people in a HIIT training facility that did that. They'll never become intermediates. It's just not enough of a stimulus. But let's say they did 4 sets. They would probably become an intermediate, maybe intermediate advanced if they respond quite well to low volume training. And then that's their baseline. They could go to 1 set and they would regress to where they were at novice and stop there. So sometimes we think a little too binarily about, growing muscle takes more volume or more work than maintaining muscle. When you go into a deficit, less recovered of capacity, therefore we should just do less just to try to maintain it. But the reality is that you've created an environment that is less conducive to building muscle, and building muscle is how we retain muscle, or at least the attempt of doing it. So really what we have to look at is, what can I recover from? And then that is going to be the constraint that I apply to what would be an optimal muscle building program. So with that perspective, when I start someone on a contest prep diet, and let's say they've got to lose 10% of their body weight to be shredded, right? That might take, and probably should take, 4, 5, 6 months, right? For the first 2 months, they're probably going to feel better because I'm going to intelligently not give them a massive amount of cardio, not create a large energy deficit, not put them into an immediate state of low energy availability, but have them losing something like a pound a week at most if they're a larger person. And they're going to have sufficient energy. Their body fat's going to be high enough. We're not going to see precipitous drops in like sex hormones. They're not going to be showing signs of REDs or anything like that. And they're still going to have a good environment despite being in a deficit because they have plenty of adipose tissue, glycogen, and they're not starting to have their body adapt and downregulate physiology to make up for that energy deficit for a while. But eventually they're going to get to the point where they're trying to creep into the single-digit body fat percentage range, or the teens if they're a female, or they're starting to throw up a lot of barriers in the process of us having to get really lean. So we might have to try to diet harder despite their body saying, no, don't do that. And now their recuperative capacities, their ability to recover from the training we're doing is compromised. And that quote-unquote ideal amount of stress that we're imposing upon them to maximally stimulate hypertrophy, to therefore try to retain as much muscle as possible, is now not recoverable, or it's actually counterproductive. So we might need to do less, or to find a way to be intelligent about delivering that stimulus in a more recoverable way, making changes to exercise selection, swapping out back squats and RDLs for something like a Smith machine good morning and a hack squat or something like that. Or distributing the training across more days. Instead of doing a 4-day upper lower, we do a 6-day upper lower, and each session's only 45 minutes, just because they really start to bonk at the 45-minute marker in their training anyway. But I think you get my point, is that you only need to reduce the stimulus you're providing to maintain muscle at the point when that stimulus is producing more fatigue than they can accommodate due to the fatigue of dieting. Rather than just doing it as an automatic, or misinterpreting some of the research we have that says, on 1/3 to 1/9 of the volume, you can maintain muscle mass. Yes, in those novices, yes, for that given period of time, but they were also dieting at the same time. So really, for someone who wants to maintain as much muscle mass as possible, you want to give them the best chance of that with the most stimulative training as possible that they can recover from, and just understanding that what they can recover from changes throughout contest prep. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, believe it or not, actually your recuperative capacity kind of increases initially during prep. Like, you start cleaning up your diet, you get more serious, you go from, let's say as a dude, like 20% body fat to 15% body fat, you just feel better. It's kind of like your typical fitness transformation. But then going from 15% to 7%, that story changes, right? So, yeah.
Very true. Was that your experience, Scott?
It sucked. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm an old man too, so I can't recover like I used to either. So it sucked. And I didn't have much muscle mass to begin with, so I just look like a skeleton up there. So it's all good.
Natural bodybuilding at its finest, my friend.
That's
they
right.
say we look like swimmers, and we're like, I don't know, I'm not that big.
Yeah. It's true. It's funny. It's very humbling when you get on stage and it's not a tested event. You're the only natural guy in the room, and it's pretty darn obvious. And you're like, yep, this isn't gonna go very well. So It's all good. It's all good. Along the same lines, I do have a quick question about peptides. Where do you stand on peptides?
I stand in a place of ignorance because I just don't know that much about it for the most part. Yeah.
Fair
It's
enough.
not something I have looked into, and it's pretty far outside of my scope. So yeah, I would be the wrong person to ask.
Fair. You had previously mentioned before the nutrition conversation about novice, and then previously in this conversation with maintaining muscle mass and minimum effective volume, being able to backslide, from intermediate to novice. How long does that take? So if we have an ACL meniscus and they're non-weight bearing because the surgeon has dictated that, they're in a brace. You can do some isometrics and things like that. But let's say you're picking this person up at 6 weeks. They haven't done anything other than straight leg raises and like squeezing their muscle. At what point did that person become a novice again? Are they a novice if before they were someone who trained intermediately, right? So you're in the gym 3 times a week. You're not a world beater, but you're not a pushover.
Right. Good question. Yeah. So this is pretty interesting because I can't give you really specific numbers, but I can give you some interesting studies that help you kind of get it, maybe a better impression of it. So
Sure.
When we look at detraining research, it can take 2 to 3 weeks before you start to see measurable losses in hypertrophy. Strength can happen earlier, but it depends upon how it's tested. And that's completely not training at all. For 1 week, sure, in most cases, you're probably going to come back deconditioned in terms of your ability to handle the workload. But if we were to chuck you in a DEXA, or if I was to MRI you, or if I was to give you an isometric test of strength on a given muscle group, it would be within the technical error of measurement. The any reduction would be pretty minor. The more time that goes on, the more we're going to see a complete lack of training result in some degree of loss of strength and muscle mass. That's different than being immobilized, and immobilized is different than going to space. So when we look at some of the different research out there, like the fastest way for someone to lose a crap ton of muscle mass is you take them out of a gravity well so that they have mass, but they don't have weight. And that's why unique technology like flywheel training or resistance bands are quite interesting for that application. But even then, they're mitigating, they're not preventing losses of muscle mass. So it is kind of like the total area under the curve of force production that occurs for someone that is going to dictate whether or not they're losing muscle. So if someone has a knee injury and they're hobbling around versus they're in a cast, that's going to be different. Versus if they're in bed having bed rest, that's going to be different. Versus you went, oh, you got a knee injury? Guess what? You're an astronaut now. That'd be really bad. Don't do that. So
mobilized in space. Do not.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Boeing.
The space mummies have the least amount of muscle out of everybody. So, also great sci-fi movie. So where does that leave us? Well, kind of going back to some of that minimum effective dose to retain your current level of fitness. There's a study where in what I would describe as novice or intermediates, like early stage, because it's a relatively long study, early stage, intermediate, late stage novice, whatever you want to call it, young individuals were able to maintain muscle mass with like 1/3 of the volume that they had been conditioned to, and the older individuals, 1/9, and older individuals 1/3. So, there's age interactions, there is the quote unquote intensity of the detraining, if you will, and then there is also the time, and all those factors come into play. And what exactly that's going to produce, it's hard to say. I think another way of viewing it is like the way I categorize a novice, an intermediate, or an advanced person is how close they are to their genetic capacity of the given quality we talk about, rather than how they compare to one another or how much they train. Because there's a lot of people who train so ineffectively that they are essentially lifelong novices or intermediates. There's other people who are constantly understanding that they need to be progressive in nature in their training, and they get much further. So when I try to determine where someone is at, I'm trying to determine, are they training sufficiently well? And then when they are, what rate of progress can they make? And if they're able to progress on a week-to-week basis, they're probably still novices. If it's like block to block, more like an intermediate. And if it's stringing together a whole program and then I look back on it and go, yeah, I think I might have made some gains, and that's more of an advanced person who's chipping away. So that is different than how we typically classify people in research. And it's different than what you might encounter in a clinical setting as well. So that's a whole lot of information. What do you take from that? I think you kind of have to do this on a case-by-case basis. Ultimately, you're trying to figure out, what can I do to mitigate any and all atrophy? And I think tools like contralateral limb training, which helps preserve some strength due to the cross-education effect, blood flow restriction, even just walking with blood flow restriction. Some studies have shown that can prevent atrophy in the lower limbs for some bouts, less consistently than doing actual training. Electrostim has actually been shown to be relatively effective, which is kind of cool if you have access to that. If you ask me the specifics and the amplitudes and all that, I don't have enough experience with it to really tell you, but I know that's a thing that does work. BFR, I have much more experience with, I could talk to. And then limiting range of motion, limiting load, doing different types of training clusters, like being creative with trying to get some type of load through the tissue, even if it is pretty far from failure, even if the volume is low. There's a big difference between what optimizes hypertrophy and what prevents atrophy. And it's a much lower threshold to clear.
Yeah.
Awesome. Eric, we want to be real sensitive to your time. And, we at the Academy can't thank you enough. And the sports performance SIG, I think the information that you just provided can really help so many of us in the physical therapy world, that I think you're a wealth of knowledge, and again, can't thank you enough. So where can people find more information? I know Meg kind of said it early on, but where's the best place to find you on social media and those type of things?
No, I just want to say a big thank you to you guys for having me on, for valuing your education and trying to figure out a way to apply it and help people. I think it's awesome, and it's a privilege. So thank you guys for your time. Where you can find me, if you're interested in like bodybuilding specific stuff, 3dmusclejourney.com we have a YouTube channel where we go over this stuff. It's very much like natural bodybuilding focused with some powerlifting, but if you love that, if that's your shtick, go for it. We have the 3DMJ Vault, where we have courses on bodybuilding program design, nutrition fundamentals for bodybuilding. We actually have a BFR course that Dr. Nick Licamelli, our doctor of physical therapy who works with our team, did. So that might be quite helpful if anyone's interested. His content is great with kind of the blend between working with strength and physique athletes and physical therapy. Mm-hmm. If you really want to nerd out, muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. That's my training and nutrition book aimed at strength and physique athletes, competitive or non-competitive. And then if you want to really nerd out like every month, then massresearchreview.com, where you can read myself, Dr. Trexler, Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple, and Dr. Zerdos's articles, or watch our videos that we put out. And we also have a lot of free content if you want to check that out. And then stuff like this, where I'm on other people's platforms, definitely see my Instagram at Helms3DMJ, where I share that stuff.
Yeah, we'll tag you in this, and this way you can kind of get it out. So
perfect. Yeah, make it a collaborator post. I'll hit accept. Low-hanging fruit. We have more than happy to.
Awesome. Again, Eric, can't thank you enough. You're amazing, and I think what we just decided is we're gonna have you on for part 2 at some point. So it was awesome.
Strength.
I'm here. Part 2, part 3, part 4. I will gladly bore people to death anytime you want.
I tell you what, you're not boring people to death. I think people are gonna love this and eat it up. So again, appreciate you so much for taking your time on your Saturday, our Friday, your Saturday, for doing this. So anyway, you guys out there watching live or watching in the video later on, thank you guys for your interest, and hope to see you on more of these podcasts in the future. So again, thanks Eric, thanks Megan, thanks Owen. See you guys soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks everyone.
Eric, man, that was awesome.